If you were ever in a position to go into a shopping mall or a bookstore at any point during the mid-1990s, then you probably recognize images such as this one. They're called magic eye posters. Y'all remember those? They're called magic eye posters, stereograms, or most of us just lovingly refer to them as those cool 3D poster things. But for those of you who do not recognize that at all, know this, that it's basically a digital image. It looks a little messy, a little chaotic, a little fuzzy, but when you allow your focus to relax and you try to see through the picture and not just at the picture, all of a sudden these 3D images come to life off the thing. Now, I know I see a lot of you trying. It's really hard in this one. It doesn't work for me either. I could do it on my laptop, but I can't do it on the screen for some reason, so it's okay if you can't do that. But if you were anything like me, you had a really hard time seeing these things. And the guys at the mall would have all these tips and tricks. They'd say, like, you need to cross your eyes and then uncross your eyes. You need to step close and then you need to step back. But nothing seemed to work for me. And that really bothered me. It bothered me because it was like everywhere around me, there's these other people who were seeing this hidden reality. This reality full of depth and texture that I just couldn't see. And that really bothered me. Because I wanted to see that fuller perspective. I wanted to see that. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we find ourselves with that same desire, that same need to see the fuller perspective, the deeper picture. It's the difference between being able to recognize words on a page and actually being able to read, to be able to put meaning and extrapolate sentences and phrases. It's that difference. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how we, as followers of God, as believers in Christ, can change our perspective, to get a deeper perspective, to look through the looking glass, behind the picture. That's what I want to talk about today. And the way I want to do that is I want to come at this issue today by asking 3 questions. One, I want to say to get a changed perspective, to get the deeper perspective, I want to say, well, what exactly is our need for that to happen? Then I want to ask the question, well, what would that look like? And then finally, I would say, well, now what can we do about it? Okay? So that's going to be how we'll frame it out. So to answer our first question, what exactly do we need? We first need to understand something about the way we experience reality. And what I want us to see is this. Our perception is often incomplete. For example, I want you to take a look at this next image. It's an image from the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay? Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? That's not your typical common garden variety image from your backyard telescope, is it? I've never seen anything like that. I still just try to get focused on the moon, right? That's about as best as I can do. But this is breathtaking. And you want to know the reason why? It's because it's a composite image. What do I mean by composite? I mean that when Hubble takes a picture of the sky, it's not just looking at Roy G. Biv. It's not just looking at our rainbow. It's looking at microwaves. It's looking at infrared. It's looking at ultraviolet. It's looking at X-rays. And the only way that we can see these kind of contours is if they take those wavelengths and then transpose it up into Roy G. Biv land. Okay? That's where we can actually see things. So now, all of a sudden, we can see these nebula and we can see all those things that make the texture just really pop out to us. Does that make sense? But our perspective, we have a very limited band of wavelengths that we can actually see. We have 3 kinds of cones in our eyes, some that detect red, blue, and green. Okay? There are something like the mantis shrimp. I know you've done a lot of studying on the mantis shrimp. The mantis shrimp have 16 different kinds of cones. They can see wavelengths of light that we just can't even process. They can see polarized light, circularly polarized light, just kinds of light that we can't even process, because apparently that's the kind of light that you need to see when you're down at the bottom of the ocean. So if you and a mantis shrimp both looked up at the night sky, it would be a very different experience for each of you, right? Because our perspective is often incomplete. And while we're in the optical world, I'm going to take it even a step further. Not only is our perspective incomplete, even what we do see is often incorrect. Okay? Take these optical illusions, for example. Let's look at this first one. Okay? In that example, those diagonal lines are actually parallel. They look crooked, but they're parallel. What about this next one? Find the black dot. Exactly. There is not a black dot, but everywhere in our periphery, it tells us that there's a black dot here somewhere, people, and I'm going to find it. But we can't. What about this last one? Which side of the scale is higher? They're actually parallel. But our eyes are trained to compensate for gravity. Those diagonal lines mess with us, and now all of a sudden, we think one side is higher than the other. Our perspective is often incomplete, and what we see is not necessarily true. Now, I want to go and take this into the philosophical level because this is where these two thoughts kind of come together. Okay? Let's say we're in an introductory philosophy class, and we're studying the nature of reality. This would be a very common first lecture you might hear. Good morning, class. What am I holding in my hand? A ball. Very good, class. Can you see this ball? They say, yes, we can see the ball. And he says, no, you can't. Like, what do you mean, no, I can't? It's right here. Of course I can. It's like, no, what you actually see is the light that is reflecting off of the ball. You cannot see the ball itself. You see the optical leftovers. Because this object is absorbing light and then reflecting light. You see the leftovers of what's reflected. So you actually can't see this ball. Am I right? And you say, well, I guess if you put it like that, I can't see the ball. Okay. Very good, class. We're getting somewhere. Now for a second question. What color is this ball? I say white. Where's the catch? Right? And he says, well, we actually know from science that white is not just one color, is it? It's the combination of all the different colors inside the rainbow, right? But you're telling me that your brain is only telling you this is one color. Is that right? Yeah, I guess that's right. So not only can you not see this ball, but the color that you do see is not necessarily an accurate representation of reality, is it? No, I guess it's not. And it's usually about this time that philosophy students start to wonder why they paid so much money to enter into a philosophy class, that a professor would tell them that they can't see this white ball. And the others leave doubting their own existence. I can't see the ball. If I can't see the ball, I can't see myself. Do I even exist? And that's welcome to a philosopher's life, right? So, our perspective is usually incomplete and often not true. So let's come back to our first question. What is it that we need? So if our brain is this interpretation machine, a moving, biased platform that is sculpting reality as it goes, what would we need to see perfect reality? We would need an objective, stationary point of truth that would be able to speak in and tell us exactly how reality is, right? And it just so happens that the Bible has a perfect word that captures all of this. It's called an apocalypse. Okay, I can tell I lost a couple of you there. You're like, okay, didn't see that coming, but hey, if we're going to talk about the end of the world, it might as well be at church, right? That's probably a safe place to be. But spoiler alert, the word apocalypse has nothing to do with the end of the world. In fact, I want you to tell me what the word apocalypse means. What we're going to do is we're going to look at several Bible verses, and I'm going to take out the English word and substitute the word for apocalypse, and you can tell me what this word means. Okay? Let's look first at Genesis 35. This is after Jacob's ladder. Genesis 35:7 says, he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God had apocalypsed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Or what about Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things apocalypsed belong to us and our sons forever. Proverbs 11:13, whoever goes about slandering apocalypses secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. Matthew 10:26, the words of our Lord says, do not be afraid of them, for nothing is hidden that will not be apocalypsed, and nothing is secret that will not be made known. Now, I'm sure we're all quick to notice that to plug in the definition end of the world in any of those verses don't really fit nice, do they? So why do we have all these images of the end of the world when we think of the word apocalypse? Well, it's because of this next verse, Revelation 1:1. Look with me. Revelation 1:1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, or the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his bondservant the things which must soon take place. The first word in Greek in that book is apocalypsis, okay? And that's where we get the title of the book. And since most people take the book of Revelation to be about the end times and the culmination of human history, then I think we just basically import all of that meaning into the word to where apocalypse now means the end of the world. But that's not really the root meaning of that word, is it? Well, as we saw from the verses before, what does the word apocalypse mean? The word apocalypse means to reveal, to uncover, or to make something that was once invisible visible. Okay? If you've ever gone to the Omni Theater in Fort Worth, if you've ever gone there, you know it's one of those curved movie screens, and it's like this 3D experience. And in their pre-show lineup, there's this sequence where you're like in a fighter jet, and it's like, and you're like, oh, this is amazing, okay? And then they get to this spot where they turn down the lights, and they want to show you the cool sound system they're using, right? And so the lights turn down in the theater, and then the lights turn on behind the screen, and you can see all these speakers hanging from the rafters, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. This is such a good sound system. But that is an appropriate definition of an apocalypse. It's something that was invisible is now made visible. And the same is true with God's apocalypse. God's apocalypse is when the light comes from shining on the screen to coming from behind to show you what it's all about, to show you what's behind the screen. That is an appropriate definition of an apocalypse. So now that we have a feel for how the word apocalypse is used in the Bible, let's go ahead and ask our first question again. What do we need? Well, we need a revelation. We need an uncovering. We need a word spoken in from an objective, stationary point of reference to be able to tell us reality. We need an apocalypse. So now let's go to our second question. What might that look like? And what we're about to see is that Revelation or God's apocalypses can look like a lot of things, but there's one common thread that runs through all of them, and it's this. When God apocalypses something to his people, it changes the way they see their entire lives. Okay? It changes the way they see their past, particularly. Let's look with me in Genesis chapter 50. And here we have the story of Joseph. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go through the entire story of Joseph, but a lot of us know that Joseph had a pretty rough ride, right? He was sold into slavery by his brothers, okay? Was falsely accused of rape and thrown in prison for something like 10 to 13 years. But he interpreted a dream for a cellmate, and all of a sudden that landed him interpreting Pharaoh's dream, and now he finds himself second in command of one of the most powerful nations in the world at the time, okay? Well, Israel experiences a famine. His brothers come down asking for food. Enter Joseph. Now the brothers are rightly afraid for their lives, right? But let's look at what Joseph tells his brothers. He says in Genesis 50:19, it says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant to harm me, but God intended it for a good purpose so that he could preserve the lives of many people, as you can see this day." Joseph could see his past clearly because of the apocalypse that God had given him in the present. Does that make sense? He could see that God had design in where he had taken him, because if he had not been able to be a steward over Potiphar's house, he wouldn't have had the skill sets to know how to store and trade that he would now need to help the country of Egypt, right? We could see design inside the past, and so God's apocalypse on the present makes sense of the past. But it doesn't stop there. God's apocalypses can also change the way we see our present. Now, this is the most common form of apocalypse. It's one that shows us where we sit or stand in the grand scheme of things. Because what we're going to see here is this. We talked about on a visual scale that we often construct our own reality, right? That we have things the way we want them to be or the way we expect them to be. But the thing is that we do this in almost every area of our lives. We do this on a moral level. We do this on a spiritual level, on an emotional level. And we really see that play out in the book of Malachi, particularly chapter 1. In this situation, the priests think they have an exact bead on what's going on. Okay? They think they're over here being the good guys, working for the man. And if anyone has to answer for their actions, it's God. Okay? He hasn't been blessing Israel. He hasn't kept up his end of the bargain. Because in Malachi, this is where we are historically. Israel has come back from the captivity. Okay? They have rebuilt the temple, sort of, and everything is just sort of hobbling along. God's not really blessing. Everyone's kind of poor, and it's really just getting by. And the priests are doing a half-hearted worship. It's just going through the motions. Now, finally, God cannot let his priests live in their little make-believe world any longer. And so he speaks. And what we see is this volley that goes back and forth between the priests and God. And God opens things up in Malachi 1:1 and says, I have loved you. I have shown deep love to you. And the priest's response is, how? How have you shown love to us? And God says, like this and this and this. And then he says, not only that, but by your actions, you show that you actually have contempt for my name. You despise my name. The priests say, how have we despised your name? God says, by doing this, by doing this, by doing this. In fact, do you want to know where I am? Do you want to know where you are? God finally lets them know. Malachi 1:10, he's like, this is where I am and this is how I feel about it. Malachi 1 verse 10 says, oh, that there were one among you who would just shut the gates, that you might not uselessly kindle fire on my altar. I am not pleased with you, says the Lord of hosts, nor will I accept an offering from you. God is saying, just stop, okay? In fact, I wish there was someone among you who had the guts to just shut it all down. At least you'd be being clean about it. But to do this half-hearted, I'm kind of there, toeing the line, I'm in, I'm out. He's like, this is not worship. I am the king of the world, and I will be exalted among the nations, and this is unacceptable for my people. Apocalypses can be a wonderful thing, but they are not always the most comfortable. I know for myself, I see myself in those priests, because it's like I think I have a pretty good reality on how things stand between me and so. You know, and I've got these scenarios playing out in my mind, and it just so happens that I'm always the good guy. You know, it's like, you know what, they did this, and that caused me to do this, and now, you know, so it's really their fault that I'm in the position that I'm in, right? Does that ever happen with any of us? Right? That is an apocalypse. Apocalypse says, you think you're here, and then God says, let me shine the light on this. We're really light years away. We're over here, guys. Okay? That is how God's apocalypse can change the way we see our present. Now, God's revelation can also throw a new focus on the way we understand our future. And my favorite passage for this is looking in Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, you know, we have King Nebuchadnezzar who just had this really crazy dream. Okay? This dream is of this huge statue. It's got a head of gold, it's got bronze and copper, and it's got these feet made of like this iron clay mix. Really weird. And then this meteorite comes out of nowhere and blasts the thing to smithereens, millions of pieces everywhere, and the meteorite is so big it fills the entire earth. The end. Pretty weird dream, right? Well, once again, God gives Daniel the interpretation of it. Will you look with me at what he says to King Nebuchadnezzar? We're in Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 38, says, you are the head of gold. Now after you another kingdom will arise, one inferior to yours. Then a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule in all the earth. Then there'll be a fourth kingdom, one strong like iron. Just like iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and as iron breaks in pieces all these metals, so it will break in pieces and crush the others. And in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. God had shown Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar what was going to happen in the future. Okay? And what I want us to see here is where God had placed Daniel historically. Okay? God had placed Daniel in a veritable mix master of human history. We see in Scripture that Daniel served in the courts of at least 4 kings in 3 different empires. We had Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, we had Belshazzar, then we had Darius the Mede, and then we end with Cyrus the Great, the Persian. Empires are literally rising and falling before his eyes. This is not just your typical election year politics, right? Empires are at stake here. And through all of this, we never see a record of Daniel saying, God, it's kind of crazy right now. Will you please just calm things down and give us a straightaway? Will you get me out of my circumstances? We don't see that. We see Daniel loving the Lord his God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving his neighbor as himself. Because ultimately, God's apocalypse of the future was for a purpose, and that purpose was to give him a vision and a hope and a purpose in the present. It wasn't just to show him cool things about the future. It was to help him live in the present. God, how do I live underneath the Babylonians? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. How about the Medes, God? How do I live underneath the Medes? Or the Persians? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what about the Persians? Or what about the Romans? Or what about 21st century America, God? Things are crazy right now. How am I supposed to live in this? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. So we've seen how God's apocalypses can change the way we see the past, the present, the future. We see apocalypses on a small scale, like with Joseph, a personal level. We see apocalypses focused on a group of people, like with Malachi. And then we see apocalypses that are focused on kingdoms, on nations, on empires. But all of these apocalypses pale in comparison to God's ultimate apocalypse. An apocalypse that's going to be on a global scale, a cosmic scale, a scale that makes us rethink how we see all of creation and human history as we know it. For God's grand finale, he doesn't just send a word into his creation. He sends the word in human flesh. Jesus Christ. John 1:1 said this word will be the word who was with God and the word who was God. The word who was with God in the beginning. Jesus Christ is a walking, talking, living, breathing apocalypse whose job it is to show us the Father. Colossians 1 will call him the image of the invisible God. Literally a physical stamp that represents an invisible object. God, who is forever spirit, translated into the Roy G. Biv land. You want to talk about not seeing the ball? The Father is the ball. We will forever be separated from that reality. But though we cannot see the ball, we can see him who is the light of the world. Philip will say, Jesus, just show us the Father. And Jesus will say, don't you get it? If you have been with me this long, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father, because I and the Father are one. Stop worrying about the fact that you can't see the ball. You can see the light, and I am telling you that that is enough. When God's apocalypse comes, you can't just put it back in the box. You have to do something with it. John, in his first chapter, in John 1:14, will say, we have seen his glory, the glory that only comes from God, full of grace and truth. John is saying, there are things that I can't just unsee. I was on the Mount of Transfiguration, and the dude just blew up in heavenly glory. I can't unsee that. There are things I now know about this man that I can't just flip a switch and unknow. I've got to do something with that apocalypse. Those of you who know the story of C.S. Lewis, in the book Surprised by Joy, he tells his conversion story. Okay? Now, C.S. Lewis started off as a staunch atheist, academic, but he describes this night in his room, or in his study. They don't call them rooms back there, right? It's in his study. And he is wrestling with this concept that God exists and has spoken through his Son. And he's wrestling on the floor of his room, and he finally gets to this spot where he's just like, dang it. It's true. I don't want it to be true, but there it is. And I've got to follow it to where the evidence leads. He describes himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England. He literally describes himself being dragged into the kingdom, kicking and screaming. He's like, because I had to follow the evidence to where it led. I don't want it to be true, but there it is. I think God exists. And I think Jesus Christ is his Son. And I'm so glad he followed that apocalypse, because that apocalypse would lead him to write some of the most influential books of the 20th century in Christian apologetics. It would cause him to write a spiritually rich and deep children's fantasy series that we know as the Chronicles of Narnia. When God's apocalypse comes on us, we have to do something with it. And that's what I want to talk about next. But first, let's go ahead and nail down our first two questions. What do we need? We need an apocalypse from God. We need a revelation. What does that look like? Well, it looks like a lot of things. But God's ultimate apocalypse, his greatest apocalypse, has come in the form of his Son, Jesus Christ. So to turn to our final question, what can we do about it? And I first want to draw the line between what we normally do with it or naturally do with it and what we should do with it. Because believe it or not, there's a difference. Okay? So one of the first ways, and probably the most benign ways that we normally treat God's apocalypse is this. We just ignore it. Okay? My favorite example of this comes from Mark chapter 9. In Mark 9, the disciples have just had a disastrous PR event where they couldn't exorcise a demon, and Jesus is sort of taking them out of the way to give them some teaching time. Right? And he is seeing the disciples argue amongst themselves, and he decides to throw a theological hand grenade in the middle of them. Just and he turns around and he says to them this. Let's look. Look with me in Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 30. It says, they left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, so what were you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. In the middle of their journey, Jesus Christ turns around and reveals to them the mystery of the ages, things into which angels long to look. God incarnate, the Son of Man, killed and resurrected. But their response was crickets. They didn't interact with Jesus on that thing. That might have been too hard, right? Because I'm just now getting used to the idea of Jesus the Messiah. He's going to conquer Rome, right? He's going to lead this into this glorious kingdom, right? Well, what if reality is not quite as I have it in my head? I don't know if I want to tango with that right now. So I think I'm just going to finish this little Facebook battle on who's really the greatest, because I got a lot of opinions about that. Boom. Right? We ignore God's apocalypse. And church, I think we ignore God's apocalypses at our own peril. Imagine what their journey would have been like if they would have stopped and interacted with Jesus on that topic. Imagine how their understandings would have changed. Now, Paul has a slightly different perspective on what we normally do with God's apocalypse. He doesn't really allow room for benign neglect. Okay? Here we see the second way that we handle God's apocalypse, and that is by actively suppressing it. Look with me at Romans chapter 1. Romans 1, starting in 18, says, for the wrath of God is revealed or apocalypsed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. For although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Paul doesn't give room for the benign neglect. He says the natural human condition is to actively suppress the truth. And in fact, he says not just suppress the truth, but suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That means seeing a truth and then covering it over with a lie. Or seeing right and then covering over that with a wrong. It's using wrong to cover over right. But a lot of us might look at that and say, yeah, Rob, but you'd have to be pretty bad to do something like that, right? I mean, there might be some people or some governments, cough, cough, who might cover up the truth with a lie, but like not me. I'm like Christian, like I like Jesus and stuff like that. That's not me. Are you saying that my first instinct is to lie? Well, I would say this. In 2010, Pamela Meyer put out a book called Lie Spotting. And as the title implies, it's dedicated to teaching a system to help people detect deception. Okay? Now, although this would be a fun skill set in any of our areas, this one was aimed at corporate America. Because at the time of writing her book, corporate America was losing up to $994 billion a year because of lies, deception, and fraud. Okay? And so this led her to go into deep research about the myriad of ways that we deceive each other every day. They started looking at facial expressions, body language, little nervous tics. They'd look at distractions, exaggerations, and just bald-faced lies. And she found this, is that on average, the average person is lied to about 200 times a day. And 75% of those lies go undetected. In fact, when you're on your guard, when you're doing your best, you can detect a lie about 56% of the time. That's just barely better than a coin toss. So I remember when I first read that, I was really indignant at it. And I was like, I walk according to the truth. I do not lie 200 times. And then I started to look at my own actions where I'm like, ha, 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 that's so funny. Where I'm like, man, it's not really honest, is it? I'm feeling different ways than what I'm revealing. And it just let me see that, man, I do deceive, even just in these little baby ways. And so it shows us two things. That research shows us that, one, we have no idea how much we lie. And two, it shows us we have no idea how much we're lied to. Okay? It shows us that we trust our computers, that we believe that most of what we're putting out to be true and most of what we're taking in to be true, even when the stats show us that we breathe in and out deception constantly. So let me ask myself that question. Rob, do you think that yourself is one who would actively suppress the truth? I would say yes. In fact, I would say for me, the problem is more, I don't know if I can stop suppressing the truth. Because if I'm honest with myself, I am controlling the narrative all the time. If I am on my A game for self-control, I am putting in front of you the picture of me that I want you to see, right? Because if you were able to really see what's going on in this mind, it's ugly, it's messy, it's sinful. I don't want you to see that. And so I'll put this front up. And not only am I controlling the narrative that's going out, I'm controlling the narrative that's going in. If I have an opinion about you, or you, I am going to look for that information that corroborates my opinion, right? If you're like, man, that person's a jerk. And so now you look for that person, and it's like all you see is the jerkiness of that person, right? Or all you see is that, oh, that's a really nice person. We take in the versions of reality that we want to uphold our own reality. Does that make sense? So yes, I consider myself one who is actively suppressing the truth, both in what I put out and what I take in. So what are we supposed to do? If you've only given us two options, that we either ignore it or we suppress it, do you have anything happier, Rob? You got a happy meal for me? Okay? Actually, I do. Because though that's how we naturally handle apocalypse, I want to look at now how we should handle God's apocalypse. And I have two ways for us. And the first thing I would tell us is this: let God's apocalypse penetrate. Let it sink in. Okay. Now, my favorite apocalypse in the entire Bible is the apocalypse that occurs to Paul on the road to Damascus. On the road to Damascus, the Apostle Paul hears a voice from heaven, Jesus' voice. He sees a blinding light, and that encounter changes Paul's entire life. But he doesn't just go out guns blazing from the very start. He has to give this time to settle in, this time to sink in and change him from the inside out. Look with me at Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 11, says this: "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached is not of human origin. For I did not receive it or learn it from any human source. Instead, I received it by an apocalypse of Jesus Christ. But when the one who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace was pleased to apocalypse his Son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not go and ask for advice from any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem and see those who were apostles before me. But right away I departed into Arabia, and then returned to Damascus. And then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter and to get information from him. And I stayed with him for 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." Paul went away for 3 years to let this sink in. And it would change his entire life. It would change the way Paul saw his past. He would say that though I am a Pharisee of Pharisees and a Jew of Jews, blameless in the law, the things that I used to consider my pride, I now call my shame. It would change the way he saw his present. He would say, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For I am crucified with Christ, but nevertheless that I live. He would say, you can put me in chains, but you can't put the gospel in chains. It will change the way he saw his future. He'll say in Romans that I don't even compare the momentary afflictions of right now to even be compared to the glory that's going to be apocalypsed in us. In fact, all creation waits with eager expectation, waiting to see the apocalypse of the sons of God. The gospel became the very center of gravity of Paul's life. It changed everything about him. And church, let's just get real quick. That very same apocalypse has been given to us. Very same one. Have we let it sink in? Are we letting it sink into our core, or are we suppressing the truth, controlling how deep it goes? I don't want to go too crazy into this, right? No, I wouldn't suppress the truth. Only bad people do that, right? Let the apocalypse sink in. Embrace the apocalypse. Final thing for us, church, that I would encourage us to do is not only let God's apocalypse sink in, but I would encourage us to let us walk forward in that truth. Can you honestly look around at the last 12 weeks and say that there's not been some form of apocalypse? I know for myself, just in my time in quarantine, this time in these last 12 weeks have brought up a lot of tough issues to the surface. The bodies have come up to the surface. They've come out of the closet, okay? And none of them have easy answers. And I can hear God just rattling questions at me back after back, one after another, like I'm in the last chapters of the book of Job. God's probing me. He's saying, Rob, let's look at your relationships. Is your identity as a son of God, or is your identity based in other relationships? Is it in your marriage? Is it in your family? Co-workers? Are you really loving your neighbor as yourself? Let me shine a little apocalypse on that for you. What about economics, Rob? Is your trust in me? Is your identity in me, or is it in a job, a steady paycheck? Is it a sense of accomplishment or productivity? What if I took that away, Rob? Would you still trust me? Are you still my son? Let me shine a little apocalypse for you. What about health, Rob? What if I took your health away? Would anything have changed between us? Did my prerogatives change? Is my job to make you holy or to make you happy and healthy? Because you used to know the answer to that. Let me shine a little apocalypse on that for you. Church, these are tough issues, tough questions, and tough answers. But we do this at our own peril to ignore God's apocalypse. So my encouragement to us this morning is to let it sink in and then walk forward in that truth, in that revelation. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. As for those 90s 3D posters, most of us can see them with a little bit of practice, okay? But we all get them after a bit. But one thing that's absolutely necessary to see those are two working eyes. So people like my father, who was blinded in one eye from a car accident years ago, try as he might, will never be able to see those 3D posters, nor will he be able to see a 3D movie. Because it takes two working eyes. And for us, church, it takes the same two working eyes. We need an eye of sight and we need an eye of faith. And as those two eyes work together, what at first looked like a two-dimensional, messy, hazy, chaotic, sinful picture of this world all of a sudden bursts to life through the eyes of faith. That we see, oh, there's design there. There's beauty there. There's purpose there. It becomes a brand new world when we're able to look at our lives through the eyes of faith. Let us walk forward in that truth, in that revelation. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Will you join me and walk forward in the truth that God is revealing to each of us? Will you pray with me? God, we look to you as the revealer of all things. God, we saw in your scriptures that revelation is not something that we do, it is something that happens to us. We need your word. We need your objective, perfect, perspective to speak into us because I am a lie factory. Your perspective and your truth is what I crave. It is what we all crave. So, Father, as we move forward, as we let your revelation sink in, may it do its work. May it change us. May it stir those things in us that leads us to live a different life, a life that Paul lived, to where everything was changed around the gospel of Christ. We give you this time. And I pray that as we go out these doors and as we live our weeks, that our eyes will be open to your revelation, that we will see it, that we will perceive it, that we will understand it, and that we will let it have its work, and that we will move forward in that. Because we desire to have our lives sculpted, tailor-sculpted to the truth that you show us, that we might be able to live out our purposes for your glory and your kingdom. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Church, I want to give you time to respond. I want to give you time to reflect that if God has apocalypsed something to you this morning, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. You might be here and you might be saying that I think Jesus is the Son of God. I think this does make sense. That I want to encourage you to text New Start to 94,000. And we can give you literature and we can help you and encourage you on your way as you start your walk with Jesus. No matter where you are in our faith, no matter where you are in your faith, God has a next step. He has an apocalypse. If we will embrace it and move forward in it, that is my prayer for us this morning. This time, we're also going to take our offering. And there'll be information on the screens that'll show us how we can do that. I think it's texting LifePoint Church to 73256. So, as the Spirit leads, we trust that you'll do that. We're going to invite you now, if you'll stand in worship. We're going to talk about apocalypse in our last song. We're going to talk about your love awakens us. So will you stand with us and let's respond in worship.